is that targeting information is being provided by the Iranians by one of two ships which may or may not be rotating. That is the MV Beshad and the MV Safiz. Now, should this go on for a long time, and the Americans really want to take high-end kinetic action against Iran as the sponsor of the Houthis, really, then potentially sinking those ships is an option.
Hello and welcome to Frontline from Times Radio. My name is Alex Dibble. I'm Times Radio's Deputy Head of News. Today on Frontline, we are talking about Houthi attacks on ships in the Red Sea with Major General Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command who served 33 years in the armed forces. He's also a commentator on geopolitics and security and is the author of the book Notes from a Small Military. Major General Chapman, thank you very much for joining Frontline.
Good afternoon, Alex.
Can we start with the report last week of the first deaths on board a cargo ship since the beginning of these Houthi attacks in the Red Sea? How do we understand the ship was targeted, and why was it such a deadly one?
Well, most targeting of ships are not deadly, is the first thing to say, and we saw this in the 87-88 tanker war. But the first fatalities tells you something about the complexity of what is going on, because the three who were killed were two Filipinos and one Vietnamese on the ship True Confidence, which was Barbados flagged, Greek operated, Liberian owned, and crewed by a miscellany of other nations. Now, in terms of the targeting, most of the ships which are being hit at the moment are not being hit in the Red Sea, neither in the Bab al-Mandeb. They'll be being hit in the Gulf of Aden. And so how do you get the targeting in that specific area? Now, one of the things that we think is going on is that targeting information is being provided by the Iranians by one of two ships which may or may not be rotating. That is the MV Beshad and the MV Safiz. Now, should this go on for a long time, and the Americans really want to take high-end kinetic action against Iran as the sponsor of the Houthis, really, then potentially sinking those ships is an option. Now, there are other ways around that. So, for example, we think that a cyber attack took place against the MV Bashad, thereby limiting its ability to either communicate or to give that targeting information to the Houthis. So there are a range of options you can do. So not only have we had the first fatalities, we've also had the first sinking, of course, with the sinking of the Ruby Mar, which again shows the complexity. It was Belizean flagged, UK owned. But more importantly, I think on the Ruby Mar, not just in terms of the potential environmental damage, is that its anchor was dragged for a number of days. It didn't actually sink until the 18th of February. But there was significant damage to undersea cables. So both of those things are important. The damage to undersea cables, which was accidental, we think, in this case, and the fact that sea denial, that is choke points, seem to be back in vogue. So not only have you got sea choke points, you've also got potentially data choke points, and that could be a weakness if they wanted to ramp up the campaign. Because a lot of the Asia to Europe data flows in the cables under the Red Sea, which of course is very narrow.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the undersea cables, actually. I was going to come on to that in a moment, but as you've mentioned it, why don't we talk about it now? So it is your assessment that it was damage done by an anchor, that there wasn't anything untoward in the damage?
I think so, but like all these things, you can have plausible deniability. It was being dragged for a number of days. I think there are 12 major cables in that area. 4 seem to have been impeded. So by looking at where those cables were and where the ship actually went, it would seem more realistic to say it was accidental. But that doesn't mean that the capability to do malign activity with those Iranian sort of motherships that I mentioned is not there, and that is an indirect approach, of course, to knocking things out. Most of those cables actually come across to Djibouti in the Red Sea and then route north to the Mediterranean, is my understanding. But it is something that they could potentially do. And like all these things, the data choke points, which we also see, for example, in the North Sea and the Baltic, are those things which, in hybrid warfare terms, are important for the future, and protecting them is important for the future.
Mm. Um, we do know that the US-led coalition is still operating ships in the Red Sea. It's intercepting missiles, intercepting drones, with several drones having been shot down by the British, by the French, by the US warships. How significant do you think is the military effort that is still ongoing in stopping the Houthis? Is it gaining strength, or is it weakening as the weeks go by?
Well, it's gaining strength because you've got another coalition, essentially, which is really just joined. So if you look at the defensive operations, initially we had a operation from 2018 called the International Maritime Security Construct. And you'd say, well, 2018 is a long time before the 7th of October. What on earth was that about? And of course, the Houthis have been at this for a long time. It is not just post 7th of October 2023. So that again was about freedom of navigation, because the Saudis and the UAE had really intervened in the civil war in Yemen, and therefore the Houthis were targeting UAE and Gulf ships in particular. So that included both Gulf states and a wider coalition. Of course, since then we've had Prosperity Guardian, 10 nations, but only the UK and the US are predominant in that, along with the French. But in the last 3 weeks, we've had Operation Aspides. That means shield in Greek. That is important because that is an EU defensive naval mission. It's a 1-year renewable mandate, which gives you the notion that this thing might go on for some time. And at the moment, that includes warships from France, Germany, Greece, Spain, Italy, with Belgium joining shortly. So there are a lot of ships involved, and the notion of just a defensive operation under Aspides, because part of the other operation is, of course, an offensive operation, which is a different name for the two members of the coalition who are doing it. That's Poseidon Archer with the US and the UK. And the hope of Aspides, which is actually the hope of all the defensive operations, is to provide confidence for the shipping companies and their insurers that ships will transit through the Red Sea, because the cost to the global economy of a prolonged interdiction of that area is going to be quite large. The latest figures would say that the OECD say that there will be a 0.4% increase in to CPI after 1 year of diverted trade, and that there are also particular countries that this impacts more than others. The first one, of course, and the most important one in a way, is Egypt and the number of Suez Canal transits. So at the moment, the transits, according to the International Maritime Organization, are down 82%, and the Cape of Good Hope transits are up 74%. Now, you'd obviously say that there's a discrepancy between 82% and 74%. And why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is the number of containers in flow at the time. There is a finite number of those. But one of the other things which affects some of the countries, particularly Mediterranean countries and Italy in particular, is that there's a difference between perishable goods and the length of time it takes for them to go around the Cape of Good Hope, and frozen goods. And for example, 40% of Italian export goods went through the Suez Canal, and a lot of that is perishable agricultural produce. Hence the delta between those two things. So it affects Egypt a lot. It will affect China, and that's one of the ways we might ameliorate this in the future, because the longer this goes on, there are greater threats to the Chinese economy, and it is potentially there that China would try and leverage its relationship with Iran, which would then lever its relationship with the Houthis. Because one of the things about the balance of defence and offence from both the Houthi side and the coalition side, and this came out from General Kurilla, the current CENTCOM commander, in the last few days, that at the moment it's okay trying to degrade the Houthi capabilities, which is ongoing, but that means nothing if Iran is able to supply them. So you need to deny that at the same time that you're taking offensive operation against them. Now, there are actually two different types of targeting in terms of the coalition targeting against the Houthis, which is why you see far more strikes from the Americans than you do from the UK. So the first thing we talk about is deliberate targeting. So you have an air tasking order, you know where fixed sites are, and you can go after those, and that's why the UK have done 4 operations. The second one is called dynamic targeting. That is because of the American capabilities in the region, both carrier based and its drone surveillance capability from Camp Mornier. They have a significant drone capability in Djibouti. They're able to do almost persistent surveillance along with their satellite based power to see when the Houthis are sort of unmasking or taking things out of storage and attempting to launch them. And that's why you have this difference between the number of strikes from the Americans and the number of strikes from the UK. There's a different capability suite between the two nations.
A lot of what you've said there is about the effect on the West, economies, and things like that as a result of what's happening, which sort of leads us back in one sense to discussion about the undersea cables, because the cables have affected 25% of data traffic between Asia and Europe, according to a company and also to US officials. I mean, that is a huge amount of data, and we now know that Houthis have said that any ships that are capable of laying undersea cables, perhaps in order to repair cables or to lay new ones, must get a permit from the Houthis in order to operate in the Red Sea, and or their security, their safety could be compromised. The effort that is going into simply maintaining the situation we had before is significant. But do you see it being one that can ultimately succeed for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years?
Well, it can certainly ameliorate it. It depends what the global coalition thinks about inflation, but more importantly, thinks about geopolitical and geostrategic events. Now, it is largely the case that the attacks started as a result of the Gaza Israeli strikes. Not wholly the case. And today is day 157. And I say that because, of course, the other thing that I mentioned earlier on was the sort of the civil war. Now, the Houthis aren't the Yemen state. They are just part of the civil war. And the legal constituted government of Yemen has condemned the Houthis for escalating tensions and dragging the country into conflict. Not only that, under UN Security Council Resolution 2722, that has demanded an immediate end to the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea. Now, what was important about that UN Security Council resolution was it wasn't vetoed by Russia or China. They abstained. And so I don't think they also want to see the sea lanes of the world interdicted, because it is generally vital interest for most countries that the international maritime trade be allowed to flow unimpeded. So you will probably see some sort of intervention in diplomatic terms using the soft power of some of these countries, particularly, as I said, China, to try and ameliorate this. Now, what is also important here is it was significant, it seems to me, that the Houthis were not designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the US. They were deemed to be a specially designated terrorist group, SDTG. Now, why is that important in the separation? The separation is because that gives the Americans freedom of providing the humanitarian and commercial support to Yemen, not necessarily the Houthis, at the same time trying to be part of the countries which are brokering a solution to the ongoing civil war, because of course the intervention originally from the Saudis in this was in 2015 under Operation Decisive Storm, which was neither a storm nor decisive. And as both the Romans, the Ottomans, the British, the Egyptians, and now the Saudis have discovered, that is why Yemen is often described as the Afghanistan of the Middle East. It's easy to get involved there. It's not so easy to get uninvolved again.
We've had a number of significant incidents in the last few days, the last week. On Wednesday, for example, the US carried out several airstrikes on unmanned Houthi aerial vehicles. Just explain what these are, and are they likely to have an impact?
Well, you've got a range of capabilities. The most significant capabilities from the Houthis are the what we call the ASBM, the anti-ship ballistic missiles, so high-end capability. Drone capability is far cheaper and less than the ASBMs, which is why the ASBMs are far more successful. Uh, then you have the surface drones, essentially unmanned ships, which could potentially do swarm attacks. There's been a number of those, and recently they've had subsurface remote vehicles to try and come forward. But the most difficult capability, or the capability likely to do the most damage, if it's posited at a merchant ship, are these anti-ship ballistic missiles. Now, over the weekend, on the 9th of March, there were 28 UAVs downed by both the British, the US, and the French. But you only need a failure in one system for one of these, of all that panoply of things I've just described, to potentially get through. And even more difficult potentially is you don't necessarily have common communications, command and control between all the various elements there. So, for example, in the last week or so, we've had an incident where the EU operation, which is actually run out of Greece, a German ship downed an American drone thinking it was a Houthi drone. Now, if you had a common recognized picture, which you would if there was a common command and control and communications between all the operating elements, that should not occur. So we've had fratricide between guys who are potentially on the same side, and that is not a good thing. That is a danger for the future. They need to try and sort that out. So there is sort of unity command or unity of liaison, which enables that between all the elements, and that's further made more complex because, of course, there are 12 Indian ships operating in the east of the Red Sea, really to do two things: fighting piracy and also to assist stricken ships, which they did, for example, in terms of the casualties on the True Confidence.
And you mentioned earlier about how the coalition is being strengthened. There are more players involved in it now. Does the risk of friendly fire increase as actually the coalition against the Houthis gets stronger and gets bigger?
Well, I think it does if you don't have that common recognised picture. There's always going to be a slip between the cup and the lip in terms of either decision making or pressing a button if you don't have the fidelity of the information on a radar screen and you've got that common recognised picture. It's what we call identification, friend or foe in sort of air terms. So you can have this sort of inertia in terms of that recognised picture, and that is dangerous for the future.
We know as well that a few weeks ago the Houthis actually shot down a US drone. There will be people who are fully aware that the Houthis have strong capabilities, others who will be surprised that they were able to shoot down a US drone. How were they able to do this? And is there now, the possibility of a threat to aircraft above the Red Sea as well?
Yes, there is, and that can be rerouted. Now, you have really to go back a bit in history to see why the Houthis are as strong as they are and how many years they've had to gather this sort of capability. Now, the real key date to begin with is it's nearly 50 years ago. So when the 1979 Iranian Revolution occurred, at the same time in that year, there was the large attack on the Grand Mosque. Now, the large attack on the Grand Mosque made the Saudis say that they would, one of the things that they did was to proselytize Wahhabism. Now, the counter reaction to that from the Zayd Shia, which is what the Houthis are, was a Islamic revivalism amongst the Houthis, who didn't like increased Wahhabism. It's this thing between Shia and the split between Shia and Sunni in the Middle East. The Houthi were then seen to be part of the Iranian axis of resistance against the cancer of Israel as they saw it. So you have this axis of resistance and ring of fire, which now incorporates the Houthis Hamas and Hezbollah. And President Hadi, he was foreign minister at the time when I met him in 2009, that a time long before anyone really in the West would have heard of the Houthis, described the Houthis to me as the Hezbollah of the North, that is Sada Governorate. They even have the same flag. So over a long period of years, the Iranians have provided a sub-state group with a high-end drone capability in the same way that they have, for example, with Hamas. So you have a mixture of low-end drones, UAVs, and high-end precision equipment in terms of the anti-ship ballistic missiles. So they do have the capability to do that, because not only have you got the Houthis supported with probably $100 million a year by the Iranians, but the initial civil war meant that the Houthis were allied with large parts of the Yemen army, so they had access to a fairly significant part of the Yemeni arsenal. And of course, that's why they are on the coastline. They're strong in the northwest and south and around, and they took Sana'a, the capital. So they've got access to the Yemeni army arsenal and have been provided with a lot of precision strike stuff by the Iranians over the years.
When you speak about the aerial issues with regard to drones, a lot of people will be wondering, well, at the moment, is the conflict, for want of a better word, between the Houthis and the coalition acting against them in the Red Sea, is it primarily being fought in the air? Is it primarily still being fought on the water? And what's the scope for that to change, maybe even week by week?
Well, we really talk about 5 domains of war now: the land, the sea, the air, cyber, and space. Now, in reality, the only one of those which isn't being used is the land one at the moment. So we've got, in naval terms, subsurface operations. We've got surface operations. We've got aerial operations against the drones. We've got cyber operations because of the interdiction of the Iranian boats. And we've also got the space power from the Americans being used, because that actually guides precision munitions in the final terminal parts. Now, in terms of the proportion of that, most of it, of course, is in the sea domain and the above surface, taking out the drones. But you can't be complacent in your technical suite across all those subsurface, surface, and above surface elements if you want to maintain your posture and make sure that you don't have a weakness. So if any of your major systems go offline and they can be detected by the enemy, that presents a vulnerability if they have the targeting information to do that. Now, most of the time, I don't think the Houthis have what we would call time-sensitive targeting, in the way that the Americans have the ability to go after targets. That is where you need an immediate response, because you see that someone poses a threat at that time as a danger to shipping or coalition forces. Only the Americans have that agility and targeting ability to do that in near real time. The Houthis don't, but the targeting information they can get on a slow-moving ship means that they can track that in terms of where it might go from A to B, extrapolate from that in terms of hours, in the way that the Americans could do it potentially in minutes.
And we've spoken about the timescales with regard to a possible end to what's happening in the Red Sea. Were there to be a ceasefire announced between Israel and Hamas, or indeed if the conflict between Israel and Hamas were to be ended more permanently, would it still be in the interest of the Houthi rebels to continue their action in the Red Sea, or do you think that's not a possibility?
I think they would, but at a very reduced level, because of their leverage that they could have over what are still their objectives within Yemen, as a way to bring about the conclusion of the civil war on terms favourable to them. So that brings leverage in that domain too. So it's not inevitable that they will cease operations just because Gaza Israel stops, because you've got two competing objectives or complementary objectives. One is, of course, to aid the axis of resistance this ring of fire in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. And the second one is to ensure that in terms of negotiations and negotiating, that they have the greatest leverage because of what they can bring to bear in the international environment. That's why there is a potential for them to still continue, and why they still want to maintain the capability, and why Iran will continue to try and provide that capability. The interdiction of that capability we saw, of course, on the 11th of January. That's the date that the two Navy SEALs, US Navy SEALs, were killed as part of that interdiction of Iranian capability going to resupply the Houthi.
And just remind us, lastly, about the context of the civil war in Yemen and how the Houthis are looking to get, as you described, favourable terms in the end of that. The context that led to all this, I suppose.
Well, it's a really complex one because Yemen really only came together as a country in 1990. And I used to go there quite a lot. And we used to describe the Yemen not as a failed state, but as an incomplete state, where both elements which were brought together in unification were brought together under really a patronage system under President Saleh. And with the sort of loss of oil revenues and bad decisions, including supporting Saddam Hussein in the 1991 Gulf War, and therefore a lot of Yemenis being kicked out of Gulf state countries and no remittances coming in, things started to degrade, not helped by the Arab Spring, which led to competition with this loss of patronage, and then this conflict post-Arab Spring starting in 2014, and thereby the intervention of the Saudis in 2015. Now, the Saudis would like to have some sort of settlement in Yemen because having a country on its southern border, which has been a problem, can impede their vision for Vision 2030, the growth of the non-oil economy in Saudi. And this is why we often get things wrong in terms of the Houthi chronology, because there have been big strikes, of course, from the Houthis in previous years. So, for example, in 2019, the oil facilities in Horey and Abqaiq were hit by Houthi rebels. And if it wasn't hit by Houthi capability, the Iranians used the Houthis, or said it was the Houthis, in terms of that plausible deniability. And we do know that in 2022, Houthi missiles hit the fuel depot in Jeddah during the Formula One Grand Prix. So they've got big leverage over what the Saudis want to achieve in their strategic vision for Vision 2030 and the tourism and hospitality industry. So it's in their interest to keep going because that does provide them all this leverage. It's a very, very complex country. And I keep on quoting H.L. Mencken, the Baltimore sage, that for every complex problem, there is a solution which is simple, neat, and wrong. And it's very difficult to see what is the correct solution here for the wider panoply of the geostrategic and geopolitical elements that make up Yemen and the surrounding countries.
Major General Chip Chapman, it's always fascinating to get your thoughts. Thank you very much for joining us on Frontline today. No doubt we'll have the opportunity, hopefully, to speak to you again in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you for taking the time to watch today's episode of Frontline from Times Radio, our podcast dedicated to defence and security. For more, do listen to the Times World in 10 podcast, where we look at not just defence and security, but all global matters, the important ones that you need to know. That is the Times World in 10 podcast. For now, though, thank you again for your time, and we'll see you soon on Frontline. Do remember to subscribe for more from Frontline and from Times Radio.